than miracles, more than the miracles, more than the bling, more than all the stuff that we think we know about Jesus. I'm going to get this thing, there we go. I'm not cutting out anymore? Good, good. Yes, indeed. More than the miracles, more than the bling. We've been talking about the historical Jesus, and speaking about what people think about Jesus, there's been this growing trend of people who think that Jesus never really existed. He was a complete myth. Hey, forget about the miracles and things like that. We don't need to worry about those things. He never really existed. He was a work of fiction and never really walked the earth. Now, there's a word that is most often used to describe these folks, not the one you might be thinking of. It's this one up here. They're called mythicists. And I'm sorry if I just sprayed the people in the front row. I think they could have picked a better word, because whenever I say that, I think of this guy here. Remember Sylvester the cat trying to say thuffer and thuckatash, and it just goes bad from there. Mythicists, kind of hard to say, but that's what they are known as. They think Jesus is a complete myth, and of course this is just more evidence of my misspent youth, watching way too much Bugs Bunny and things like that, as if such a thing were possible. Part of the problem with the mythicist point of view is that they can't seem to separate Jesus as a historical figure. They can't separate that from some of the more fantastical and supernatural stories that came to be associated with him. And the other problem, of course, is that there is this complicated religious framework that was created much later by people who were trying to make sense out of what had happened, trying to make meaning out of the historical events. Now, if you find this subject interesting, the historical Jesus versus the mythicist arguments, the best book that I found dealing with the subject is this one up here called Did Jesus Exist by Professor Bart Ehrman. I think he does a great job of sorting through the different arguments made by the mythicists. He addresses them head on and makes a very good case, in my opinion, that Jesus really existed. I side with the people who think that he was a historical figure. And that doesn't mean that we're required to take all of the stories literally. Often I think there was a grain of truth. There was something that really happened that got embellished by over-enthusiastic followers. Other times the stories were indeed complete fabrications. Sometimes they made these fabrications in order to make Jesus look like the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. For example, he most certainly was not born in Bethlehem. His home was Nazareth. But those Bethlehem birth stories were important because the prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures promised that the Messiah would come from the city of David, which was Bethlehem. Now that really shouldn't be a deal killer for anyone, I don't think. We do the same thing with our own historical figures like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. There's all sorts of legends and myths about them. They were real people, but some of the things that they supposedly did never actually happened. So it gets to be difficult to discern where history ends and the legend begins. Unity has never tried to cover up its Christian roots, but we've also made it very clear that we have little, if anything, in common with traditional Christianity. We use the life and teachings of Jesus as an example that we want to emulate instead of an abstract belief system or turning him into an idol to be worshipped. This tradition is closest to our own culture, which doesn't mean that we work with it exclusively, because if you've been around here for a while, you know that we draw on the spiritual teachings of other traditions, science, humanism, and things like that as well. I like to think of it like the concept of homeroom in grade school. It's our homeroom. We spend time there, but we also go other places to study other spiritual traditions and subjects. The key is that whatever it is, Jesus, other spiritual traditions, it has to help us to get along better on planet Earth. You know, there's no planet B. This is it. This is where we have to do our work. It has to add some quality to our lives. The best part of all of this is that we get to engage in critical thinking when it comes to all of the things that we study, including Jesus. Our goal, and this is something that Charles Fillmore said over and over again, our goal is to discern the truth and prove it. Is it true based on everything that we've come to know about reality today? I don't have to believe that Jesus really rose from the dead, or raised Lazarus, or walked on water in order to appreciate his dedication to teaching some very, very important principles like justice, equality, compassion, unconditional love, and I can go on and on. So today is Palm Sunday, according to the traditional Christian liturgical calendar. That was when Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem and was greeted like a rock star by the stories in the Gospels. The crowds loved him, gave him an enthusiastic greeting, and then 5 short days later, he's hauled off by the Romans, executed like a common criminal for being a nuisance, and the adoring crowds are the ones who are hanging around saying, "Crucify him." It's quite a change of fortune in just 5 short days. So what might we learn from the Palm Sunday stories about the historical Jesus? And I said stories because this one appears in all 4 of the Gospels, which is somewhat unusual, something that we have to pay attention to. 4 stories, and each of them have some really significant differences. For example, only John specifically says that the people greeted him with palm branches. Doesn't even say what they did with them. Did they wave them? Did they fan themselves with them? You know, did they form the letters Jesus with them? It doesn't say. It doesn't say. It doesn't even say they put them down on the road in front of him in that gospel, but that's the only place we find palm branches. The oldest gospel is Mark. You would think, being closest to the source, it might have something enlightening to say. Mark chapter 11, it says, "Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields." It doesn't even say they got them from trees. Could have been ferns, for all we know from Mark. Then there's Matthew 21. Matthew 21 says, "A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road." Not palms. Could have been oak trees, olive trees, we don't know. And then finally we have Luke chapter 19, where it's all cloaks, no branches. It says, "As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road." Okay, so here's a question. Based on all of that, don't you think they should have called it Cloak Sunday? Just doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? Cloak Sunday, Fern Sunday, Tree Branch Sunday, you know. So tradition is powerful, but when you actually read the Gospels, you got to be thinking, I wonder why that won out from one passage in one Gospel over all the rest. Because people like it. They dig it. They figure, hey, the only trees over there in Israel are palm trees, right? Not the case. But anyway, here's the point. For the mythicists who say that it was a complete work of fiction, I ask this question. If you're going to make up a story out of whole cloth, can't you get it right? Can't you get it consistent? If you're going to have 4 different fictional versions, you'd think that these conspirators would sit down and get their facts straight. And then we have one other strange bit from Matthew that gets completely overlooked in this story. Let me ask you this. What was Jesus riding when he entered Jerusalem? A donkey, an ass, right? Everybody knows that, right? Well, according to Matthew, He was actually riding on 2 animals. All right? I'm going to read the passage here from Matthew. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. Now try to imagine how that would work. How do you ride 2 animals at once, right? You might see something like that in a rodeo. But here, in the Palm Sunday story, it just seems plain wrong. And this is not an obscure translation. This is straightforward, New Revised Standard translation of the Gospel of Matthew, where he's very clearly riding on 2 animals. Why do 3 out of 4 Gospels describe 1 animal, with Matthew very clearly saying there were 2? Either 1 account or 3 are wrong. There's also the possibility that all 4 are wrong. And I'll tell you, Christian apologists who try to make sense out of these stories, they get themselves twisted into a pretzel over this one. It takes them a book this thick just to explain that one passage and what it really means and why they said 2. Actually, the explanation is pretty simple. You can find the explanation for what happened a little bit earlier in the Gospel of Matthew. Just a few lines above, where in Matthew it says, "This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, 'Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you humble and mounted on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey.'" Matthew is quoting from the book of Zechariah in that passage. Zechariah is a prophet that's found in the Hebrew Scriptures. So here we go again. We've got an author who is trying to show that Jesus was the person who was promised by the prophets, trying to show that Jesus matched what the prophets were saying. And in this case, he blew it. He blew it bad. He totally misinterpreted Zechariah. The way it was written there in Zechariah, it's a technique that's called poetic parallelism. This is something that was a very common literary device that was unique to that ancient culture. Doesn't make much sense to us today, but it was very common in ancient Hebrew literature. Apparently it didn't make much sense to the author of Matthew either, because he took it literally instead of poetically. And as a result, we get that strange scene with Jesus riding 2 animals. All this goes to show how difficult it is to know what's real in the Gospels. And when we see conflicting accounts like this, it tells us to be very careful. Those juicy details may not be accurate, and what we need to do is to focus on the gist of the story, not the literal details. I remember when I was practicing law, I tried a lot of construction accident cases and came to learn that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. Most people who were at the accident scene, they could tell you the basics of what had happened. They'd say, oh, the scaffolding collapsed and this guy fell off and hit the ground. After that, it gets real complicated. Well, was he wearing a hard hat or not? What color was the hard hat? How many sections of scaffolding collapsed? How many people were on it? And so on and so forth. You ask 5 people, chances are you're going to get 5 different answers. The best we can do with the Gospels at times like this is to focus on the basics, focus on the gist, and be very careful, and dare I say even a bit skeptical when it comes to the details. What we can say, I think with relative certainty about Palm Sunday, or Cloak Sunday if you prefer, is that Jesus did indeed go to Jerusalem. He went to Jerusalem the week before he died, and people took notice of him once he arrived. That's easy to understand because Jesus was always known to draw crowds when he was going around teaching and preaching around the countryside. This was a world of Roman imperial domination, a world of oppression, a world of the kind of poverty that you only find in places that are ruled by an emperor, a monarchy, an oligarchy, things like that. So with that kind of poverty around, he had a message that got people to pay attention. The people who were oppressed, impoverished, suffering, they paid attention to his message. I've been working with these gospel stories for a long time now, and I think I've managed to summarize what I find to be the 7 most compelling ideas and principles that we encounter in the life and, of course, the teachings of Jesus. Now, these aren't meant to be all-encompassing, but I think they're a good core example of the principles and the values that Jesus was willing to die for. So here they are. I think I have them in your handout, I hope. I had a little problem with my slide formatting today, so I'm just going to read them here. They should be in the handout. Would somebody verify, are they indeed in the handout? Did I get that right? Thank you. All right. So the first one says to seek reconciliation instead of revenge when you're wronged. Number 2, look for creative, transforming, non-violent alternatives instead of repaying violence with violence. Number 3, focus on internal transformation, as Paul interpreted it later. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, being transformed in love instead of external conformity to moral codes. Number 4, welcome everyone, including outsiders and outcasts, into a new community that celebrates love, justice, and respect for all, no matter what. Number 5, discover the deeper meaning of life and what it means to be human, instead of anxiously chasing after money, security, pleasure, and social standing. Number 6, make sure you care at least as much about the well-being of others as you do for yourself, especially those you consider to be the least among you. And finally, love and forgive your enemies and critics. That's the kind of thinking that would get you killed in first century Palestine. Teach those things and you were a target for death. Go figure. How did that threaten the power structure? It's amazing, isn't it? Jesus didn't say, follow me into the glorious afterlife because I'm God and you're not. He said, do this in memory of me. Do this. Put these values into practice and remember what I was willing to die for. And the message got through. And it all went pretty well for a couple of 100 years. The early followers of Jesus, they weren't obsessed with the afterlife like I think so many Christians are today. The early followers were focusing on building a new kind of community in this life, because they remembered what Jesus said about the kingdom of heaven. It wasn't in some far-off place or some far-off time. It was here, it was now, it was among you, it was within you, according to the different translations. Right here. Instead of believing in life after death, the early followers seemed to be more focused on life before death. I saw a bumper sticker like that, probably a couple of years ago, which said, I believe in life before death. I thought that was great. And the one person who was the most instrumental in helping to get this message to spread in the early days was Paul. If you want to get an idea of what kind of community Paul was advancing based on what he understood people who had actually been with Jesus, based on his understanding of what they told him, check out the passage from Paul's letter to the Galatians. Very simple. He says, there is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Not Jesus Christ, Christ, the Christ comes first. That's that universal principle that we talk about, which embodies all of those values and virtues that we've talked about. So that was a radical message, to say there is no longer Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free. That was a radical message in a world that was divided by some very rigid social hierarchies, divided by gender identification and separation. Slavery, ethnic discrimination was rampant. I think we can see how it would be a message that was enthusiastically received by people who were marginalized by a dominant, oppressive culture. That's what got the crowds to come. And I barely touched on what he had to say about money, wealth, and materialism. We'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. But for now, let's just say that despite the discrepancies and the inconsistencies when it comes to the details, we have a solid foundation of ethical teachings that sparked a major shift in consciousness. And that shift in consciousness spread around the world and changed the face of the earth, literally. More on that next week for Easter Sunday. See you then.